The air in the Henderson Hall colloquium room was thick with the scent of old books, lemon polish, and the quiet, simmering terror of academic judgment. It was a room built to intimidate, all dark wood paneling, portraits of stern-faced university founders, and a heavy, oppressive silence. This was the arena, and today I was the gladiator. My name is Lena Reyes, and for 4 years, I had been the ghost in the machine of Northwood University. While my classmates were at football games, I was in the computer science lab, teaching myself Python, while they were pulling all-nighters fueled by coffee and cramming for exams. I was in the library's special collections, my fingers tracing the faded ink of 17th century manuscripts. I was a double major in history and computer science, a combination so bizarre to the old guard of the history department that they treated me with a kind of cautious, anthropological curiosity, as if I were a strange new species they hadn't yet decided how to classify. Today was the culmination of my entire academic life, the defense of my senior thesis. My project, the work that had consumed me for 2 years, was titled Project Delphi. It was a custom-built artificial intelligence, an algorithm I had designed from the ground up, trained on the entire corpus of classical Greek literature. Its purpose was simple, yet revolutionary: to read, to learn, and to identify hidden patterns of influence and textual borrowing that no human scholar could ever hope to detect. It was my creation, my baby, and I was about to show the world what she could do. My grandfather, Dean Alistair Reyes, was in the back of the room. He was not there as the dean. He was there as my Lolo, his presence a quiet, steadying anchor. He gave me a small, encouraging nod. I took a deep breath and began. For 45 minutes, I held the room captive. I didn't just present data. I told a story. I showed them how Project Delphi had ingested the fragmented, incomplete works of the minor playwright Eupolis of Athens. Then I showed them how it had cross-referenced those fragments against the complete works of his contemporary, the great Aristophanes. The screen behind me lit up with a complex, beautiful web of interconnected lines, a star chart of linguistic patterns, metric structures, and thematic echoes. For centuries, I explained, my voice ringing with a passion I rarely showed. Scholars have assumed that Aristophanes was the primary influence on his peers. But Project Delphi has revealed a different story. I pointed to a dense cluster of connections on the screen. The data shows with a 92% probability that the influence was flowing the other way. Aristophanes wasn't just the master, he was the student. He was borrowing, adapting, and refining the techniques of his forgotten, less successful contemporary. Eupolis didn't just exist in the shadow of a giant. He was the giant whose shoulders Aristophanes stood upon. A ripple of stunned, excited murmurs went through the room. A few of the younger professors were leaning forward, their faces alight with discovery. I had done it. I had used my machine to unearth a secret hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. I had given a voice back to a ghost. I finished my presentation and turned to the faculty panel. Thank you. I welcome your questions. And that's when Professor Alistair Finch, my own thesis advisor, picked up his knife. Professor Finch was a legend in the history department, a titan of classical scholarship who had written the definitive books on Thucydides 3 decades ago and had been coasting on that reputation ever since. He was a man who believed that history was a sacred text and that the only tools required to interpret it were a leather armchair, a pipe, and a finely honed sense of intellectual superiority. My thesis, my beautiful machine, he had treated with a kind of paternalistic disdain from the very beginning, viewing it as a cute but ultimately blasphemous toy. He cleared his throat, a dry, rustling sound that commanded the room's absolute attention. Thank you, Miss Reyes, for that spirited presentation, he began, the compliment already curdling into an insult. You have certainly provided us with a great deal of data. He let the word hang in the air as if it were something distasteful. However, he continued, steepling his fingers, scholarship is not about data. It is about interpretation. It is about the nuanced human understanding of a text. What you have presented here is not scholarship. It is a high-tech magic trick, a parlor game played with algorithms and processing power. I felt a cold knot of dread begin to form in my stomach. This was not a critique. This was an attack. Your project, Delphi, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, is a black box. You feed it text, it spits out patterns, but you cannot explain the why. You cannot explain the nuanced human process of its conclusions. You have abdicated the role of the historian to a machine. You have asked a calculator to interpret a poem. With all due respect, Professor, I countered, my voice steady despite the frantic pounding of my heart. The program doesn't replace the historian. It's a new tool. A new kind of microscope that allows us to see connections that were previously invisible to the naked eye. The final interpretation is still mine. Finch waved a dismissive hand. A tool that you yourself admit you cannot fully explain. You have created something that is beyond even your own comprehension, and you are presenting its conclusions as fact. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And that brings me to my most serious concern, plagiarism. The word hit the room like a physical blow. The excited murmurs died instantly. My grandfather in the back straightened in his chair. Plagiarism? I repeated, my voice a shocked whisper. How could it possibly be plagiarism? The A I wrote. Nothing. It only identified statistical similarities. Precisely. Finch pounced, his eyes glinting with a hunter's triumph. Your machine has scanned and processed the work of hundreds of other scholars, has it not? It has absorbed their interpretations, their translations, their life's work, and it has regurgitated them back to you in the form of these patterns. You are presenting as your own discovery a conclusion that has been synthesized from the uncredited labor of 1,000 other minds. It is the most sophisticated and most insidious form of academic theft I have ever seen. You haven't written a thesis. You have simply created a machine that is better at stealing than any human student. The room was utterly silent. He had taken my creation, my beautiful revolutionary tool, and painted it as a monstrous engine of intellectual theft. He was so eloquent, so authoritative, that his insane, technophobic argument began to sound plausible. The other professors on the panel, men and women who had known him for decades, were now looking at me with a new, cold suspicion in their eyes. In that moment of profound public humiliation, my mind fled. It fled the dark wood paneled room in Boston and flew across the world to my Lola's kitchen in Texas. I was 12 years old. I had just lost my school's spelling bee on a word I knew how to spell, but had been too nervous to say correctly. I was crying, convinced I was a failure. My grandmother, her hands smelling of garlic and ginger, had taken my face in her hands. There will always be people, Mac, she had told me, her voice a mixture of love and steel, who will try to make their own light brighter by blowing out your candle. Do not let them. You just find your own wind and you burn brighter. I found my wind. You're wrong, Professor, I said, my voice quiet but firm, my gaze locked on his. You're wrong about the technology, and you are wrong about my integrity. He just smiled a small, pitying smile. He turned to the other members of the panel. I have been this student's advisor for a full year. I have repeatedly warned her of the intellectual dangers of her methodology. She has chosen to ignore that counsel. He turned back to me, his face now a mask of grave, regretful authority. As your advisor and as the chair of this panel, I cannot in good conscience pass this thesis. It is a failure of academic rigor and my fear of academic ethics. He let the words settle. The final killing blow, and as the senior thesis is a required component for the awarding of your degree, he concluded, his voice resonating with a terrible finality. You, Miss Reyes, have failed. It was a public execution. The whispers in the room were a rising tide of shock and secondhand shame. My friends, my classmates, stared at me with wide, horrified eyes. The visiting scholars looked at me with pity. The professors on the panel shuffled their papers, refusing to meet my gaze. None of them, not one, spoke up in my defense. They were all cowed by the tenured titan, the legend. Alistair Finch got my degree. My graduate program at MIT, my entire future, all of it gone. Burned to ash by the words of one bitter old man who was afraid of a future he could not understand. I stood there at the podium, my body numb, my ears ringing. I packed my laptop, my notes, my hands moving with a stiff, robotic precision. And then I walked out. I walked past the other students. I walked past the other professors, and I walked past my grandfather. I couldn't look at him. The weight of his disappointment, whether real or imagined, was the most unbearable part of it all. I walked out of Henderson Hall and into the manicured perfection of the Northwood University campus. The sun was shining. Students were laughing on the lawn. The world was moving on completely, oblivious to the fact that my own world had just come to a complete and utter end. My Lola had told me to burn brighter. But in that moment, all I could feel was the cold, dark, and bitter sting of my own ashes. The walk from Henderson Hall back to my dormitory was the longest walk of my life. The late afternoon of August 3rd was beautiful, the Boston air crisp, the ivy on the old brick buildings a perfect picturesque crimson, but I saw none of it. My world had collapsed into a single, tight, monochrome pinprick of pure humiliation. The echoes of the colloquium room followed me, the shocked whispers of my classmates, the smug final pronouncements of Professor Finch, the heavy, unbearable silence of my grandfather. My phone was buzzing incessantly in my pocket. Texts from my friends. Lena, are you okay? That was insane. Finch is a monster. Don't listen to him. Your thesis was brilliant. The sympathy felt like acid. I ignored them. What could I say? Thank you, but my degree was just invalidated and my future has been erased. But other than that, I'm fine. I barricaded myself in my dorm room. The room itself felt like a museum of a dead person's life. The books on ancient Greece, the complex diagrams of my AI's neural network I had taped to the walls. The acceptance letter from MIT's graduate program I had pinned to my corkboard. It was all a monument to a future that no longer existed. At 8:15 p.m., the official email arrived from the university registrar. The subject line was cold and clinical, regarding your academic standing. Dear Miss Reyes, it read, this email is to formally notify you that due to the failure of your senior thesis, a mandatory requirement for graduation, you have not met the conditions to be awarded a Bachelor of Arts degree from Northwood University. Your academic status has been updated accordingly. We are obligated to inform all relevant postgraduate institutions of this change. It's real. Until that moment, a small, irrational part of me had thought this was all a terrible dream, a nightmare I would wake from. But the email, with its cold, bureaucratic finality, made it real. They were already notifying MIT. They were erasing me. I curled up on my bed, the shame so heavy it felt like a physical weight, like a lead blanket pinning me down. The anger was there, a white-hot coal in my chest, but it was buried under a mountain of helpless despair. Finch had won. He had blown out my candle, and I was left in the suffocating darkness with no idea how to find a new wind. I had one card left to play. One powerful, final nuclear option, my grandfather. The dean, he would fix this. He had to. His office was in the oldest building on campus, a Gothic stone monstrosity called Founders Hall. It was a place of power. All dark wood, Persian rugs, and the hushed, reverent silence of old money and even older ideas. It was after 9 p.m. now, but the lights were still on. He was waiting for me. My Lolo, Dean Alistair Reyes, was a titan in the world of academia, but he had always just been Lolo to me. The man who taught me how to read, who smelled of old books and peppermint. Tonight, however, as I stood before his massive oak desk, he was not my Lolo. He was the dean. His face was etched with a deep, weary sadness, but his eyes were clear and steady. I expected you sooner, he said, his voice a low rumble. Needed a moment, I said, my voice coming out as a choked whisper. I understand, he said. Sit down, Lena. I didn't sit. I was too full of a furious, righteous energy. Did you hear him? I began, my voice trembling with rage. Did you hear what he did? He called my work a magic trick. He called me a thief. He failed me, Lolo. He failed me out of spite because he's an arrogant, bitter old man who is terrified of a technology he doesn't understand. You have to do something. You have to reverse the decision. You have to convene a new panel. You have to fire him. The words came tumbling out, a torrent of grief and demand. He listened patiently, his hands steepled on his desk, his gaze unwavering. Let me vent, let me pour out all my fury and my pain. When I was finally done, breathless and shaking, the room fell silent. Yes, he said finally, his voice quiet. I heard him. And what I heard was a tenured professor with a formidable reputation leveling a serious, albeit technophobic, critique of a student's methodology. I stared at him, my blood running cold. A critique? He called me a plagiarist. He invalidated my degree in front of the entire department. And his argument, my grandfather continued, his voice still maddeningly calm, was based on the principle of academic freedom. He has the right, and indeed the duty, to fail any work he believes does not meet the university's standards, no matter how much I may personally disagree with his assessment. So that's it? I asked, my voice incredulous. He gets to destroy my life because of his academic freedom, and you're just going to sit there and let him? What would you have me do, Lena? He asked, and for the first time, a note of steel entered his voice. Should I, the dean of the university, summarily overrule the decision of my most distinguished history professor simply because the student in question is my granddaughter? What do you think that would look like to the world, to the board of trustees, to every other student at this university? He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened campus. Professor Finch has spent the last 4 years whispering in the faculty lounge that you are only here because of me, that your scholarships, your awards, your very presence at this institution is a product of nepotism. He is wrong. You and I know he is wrong. You are the most brilliant student I have seen in 30 years. But if I step in now, if I use my power to save you, you will prove him right. His words were a series of devastating, logical blows. He was right. I could see the trap. Finch hadn't just failed me. He had placed me in an impossible position. If I did nothing, I lost. If my grandfather intervened, I would win, but my victory would be forever tainted. I would never be Lena Reyes, the brilliant scholar. I would always and forever be the dean's granddaughter. The girl who had to have her Lolo fix her problems. It's not fair, I whispered, the fight going out of me, replaced by a cold, bleak despair. No, it's not, he agreed, turning back to face me. The world is rarely fair. Your grandmother knew that. He walked over to a small table and picked up a framed photograph. It was of my Lola, taken years ago, standing on the beach in Texas, the wind in her hair, a defiant smile on her face. When your Lola first came here to Boston, he said, his voice softening, she faced a world that was not built for her. The other faculty wives, they were polite, but they were cold. They saw her as an exotic curiosity. They whispered about her accent. They made jokes about the food she cooked. He smiled sadly. She could have come to me. I was a young, ambitious professor then. I could have defended her, used my influence to make them accept her, but she refused. He looked at me, his eyes full of the memory. She told me, Alistair, you cannot fight my battles for me. You cannot make them respect me. I must earn that myself. So that's what she did. She started a small cooking class, teaching those same women how to cook the Filipino dishes they had secretly mocked. She taught them about our culture, our history. She didn't demand their respect. She earned it by showing them a world they were too ignorant to see. She did not take the easy path. She built her own. He set the photograph down and looked. At me, his gaze intense. She built her own strength, Lena. She never asked anyone to give it to her. That is the woman whose blood is in your veins. That is the strength that is in you. He walked back to his desk. This is your fight, not mine. Professor Finch has accused you of being a fraud, a product of privilege. I know you are not. But now you must prove it to the world. You must prove it to yourself. How? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. How can I prove it? He's a tenured professor. It's his word against mine. Then make your word undeniable, my grandfather said, his voice now a low, powerful challenge. He didn't just disagree with you, Lena. He acted with malice. He was cruel. He enjoyed it. A man like that, a man whose ego is so vast and so fragile, is a man with weaknesses. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. I will not intervene on your behalf, but I am still the dean of this university, and if a student brings me concrete, irrefutable, public proof of a professor's academic misconduct, then I am obligated to act. He was not offering me a shield. He was offering me a sword, but I would have to forge it myself. This is the most important test of your life, he said. It is not about your thesis. It is not about your degree. It is about who you are. Are you the girl who needs her grandfather to save her? Or are you the brilliant woman who can save herself? He gave me a long, hard look. Prove you're more than just my granddaughter. I left his office in a daze. The despair was still there, but it was now mixed with a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. He had not given me what I wanted. He had given me what I needed, a mission, a target, a path. I walked through the empty, silent campus under the moonlight. The ancient Gothic buildings no longer felt like a home. They felt like a hunting ground. My grandfather was right. Finch's ego was his weakness. He hadn't just failed me because he was a traditionalist. He had failed me because my work, my AI, had shown him something new, something he couldn't understand. And it had made him feel small, irrelevant. He hadn't critiqued my work. He had tried to murder it out of fear, and fear I knew made even the smartest people make stupid mistakes. I got back to my dorm room. The anger was back, but it was different now. It was not the hot, helpless rage of a victim. It was the cold, patient, focused fury of a hunter. I was no longer a student begging for a passing grade. I was a scholar, and I was about to go to war with a fraud. I sat down at my desk and pulled my laptop towards me. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I was not looking at job applications or crying into my pillow. I was designing a trap. A beautiful, elegant, inescapable intellectual trap. And Professor Alistair Finch was going to walk right into it his own arrogance the key that locked the door behind him. My Lola had told me to find my own wind, and I was about to become a hurricane. My grandfather had not given me a sword. He had given me a mirror. He had forced me to look at the situation not as a wounded granddaughter, but as a strategist. And the reflection I saw was not of a victim, but of a fighter who had been using the wrong weapons. I had tried to fight Finch with emotion, with appeals to fairness, but Finch didn't operate in a world of emotion. He lived in a world of ego, reputation, and intellectual vanity. To beat him, I had to enter his world. I had to build a better trap dot my dorm room, once a place of shame and despair, transformed into an intellectual war room. For the first 2 days, I did nothing but study my enemy. I downloaded every paper Professor Finch had ever published. I watched every recorded lecture of his I could find online. I was not just reading his work, I was psychoanalyzing it. I was mapping his mind, looking for the cracks in his intellectual armor, and I found it, a pet theory. A small, obscure argument he had made in a footnote of his magnum opus 20 years ago. He had posited the existence of a lost school of pre-Socratic philosophers who had, he argued, secretly influenced Plato. It was a contrarian, almost laughable theory, one for which he had no proof, and one that had been soundly dismissed by his peers. It was the one time in his illustrious career he had been wrong, and I knew with the certainty of a profiler that it had haunted him ever since. His ego could not abide that single, solitary intellectual defeat. This would be the hook. This would be the foundation of my honeypot. I would not just give him a piece of bait. I would create the one piece of evidence he had been dreaming of his entire life. The one discovery that would not only validate his obscure theory, but would also humiliate all the colleagues who had once dismissed him. It was a trap perfectly tailored to the shape of his academic pride. If I built it, he would come. He would not be able to resist. The creation of the forgery was the most intense, most exhilarating, and most diabolical act of my academic life. I was no longer just a scholar. I was a counterfeiter, a weaver of lies, and my loom was my laptop top first. I created the author, the pseudonym. I couldn't just post the document myself. It had to come from a place of unimpeachable authority. I created the online persona of Dr. Albrecht Schmidt, a reclusive, elderly, and entirely fictional German classicist who had supposedly spent the last 50 years in quiet study at a monastery on Mount Athos. I built him a sparse but believable digital footprint, a few mentions in obscure academic forums from years ago, a registration for a conference he never attended. He was a ghost, a perfect vessel for my intellectual poison. Then came the manuscript itself. I gave it a suitably grandiose title, The Aletheia Fragments. Aletheia, the Greek word for truth, a private, bitter joke. I wrote the 20-page document in flawless academic German, a language I was fluent, and thanks to my graduate program requirements, the text was a supposed analysis of a set of newly discovered papyrus fragments that seemed to be a lost dialogue from the very school of philosophers Finch had theorized. It was filled with dense, scholarly arguments, footnotes, and cross-references. It was, on the surface, a masterpiece of traditional Old World scholarship. The kind of thing Finch adored, but it was the flaws, the poison pills, as I called them, that were the true art of the piece. They had to be perfect, too obvious, and he'd spot them. Too subtle, and they'd have no impact. They had to be verifiable errors, but so obscure that no one but a machine, my machine, could ever be expected to find them all. I spent a week crafting them. I invented a correspondence between two philosophers, but I deliberately used a Greek phrase that only came into popular usage 100 years after they had died. an anachronism so subtle it would be almost impossible to catch without a massive linguistic database. I fabricated a quote from a known historical text, but I altered a single word, changing its entire meaning in a way that just happened to perfectly support Finch's pet theory. My greatest creation was a short, fragmented poem I embedded in the text. I wrote it myself in perfect Homeric Greek, mimicking the meter and style of the period. It was beautiful, and it was a complete fraud. I wove into it a metrical pattern that was mathematically inconsistent with 99% of all other known works from that era. A statistical anomaly my AI, Project Delphi, would flag in less than a second dot as I worked, weaving these intricate threads. Of truth and deception, my mind kept going back to my Lola. I remembered sitting with her on the porch of her house in Texas, watching her weave a banag, a traditional Filipino sleeping mat, from dried reeds. Her hands, wrinkled and sure, would move in a blur, taking hundreds of individual strips of color and interlacing them, one over the other, until they formed a single, strong, beautiful, and incredibly complex pattern. That's what I was doing. I was taking the reeds of truth-real historical context, accurate linguistic styles, and I was weaving them together with the poisoned reeds of my own creation. The result was a beautiful, complex, and utterly inescapable trap. It was a work of art, a Filipino art of patient, intricate, and deadly construction. The trap was built. Now, it was time to set it. I logged into the online forum. It was called Classics Confidential, a members-only message board for the world's most elite and obsessive classical scholars. It was an intellectual hothouse of obscure debates and massive egos. And I knew, from his own public statements, that Professor Finch was a frequent lurker. I uploaded the PDF of the Aletheia fragments under the name of my ghost, Dr. Albrecht Schmidt. I wrote a short, humble post to accompany it. Esteemed colleagues, my apologies for this intrusion. I am an independent scholar of a certain age, not entirely comfortable with this new digital world. However, during a recent cataloging of the library, at the Agiu Pavlu Monastery, I came across a small codex containing the enclosed manuscript. The author is unknown to me, but the content seems significant. It touches upon the pre-Socratic Athenian schools and their influence on Plato. I am afraid I am too old for the rigors of a full academic investigation, but I felt I could not, in good conscience, let this discovery remain in the dark. I offer it to this learned community in the hopes that one of you might be able to shed some light on its importance. Yours in scholarship, A. Schmidt. The post was a masterpiece of feigned humility and academic catnip. I had laid the bait. I logged out, my heart pounding. All I could do was wait. The first few days, nothing. Just a few polite comments from other scholars, thanking Dr. Schmidt for sharing and promising to read the manuscript when they had time. I began to fear I had been too subtle, that my trap was too clever to obscure. Then, on the fourth day, he took the bait. A new comment appeared on the thread. The author, A. Finch, Northwood University. My breath caught in my throat. To the esteemed Dr. Schmidt, his comment began. I have just finished my initial review of your Aletheia fragments, and I must say I am utterly astounded. This is not merely a significant discovery, it is revolutionary. It is, without question, the most important contribution to our understanding of Platonic influence in the last century. I have already begun my own verification of the sources, and they appear to be impeccable. This is a vindication of a school of thought that has long been dismissed by the academic establishment. I will be pursuing this line of inquiry with the full resources of my university. Thank you, sir, for this monumental gift to our field. The fish had not just taken the bait. He had swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. He was so blinded by his own ego so thrilled at the prospect of being proven right after all these years that he had abandoned all scholarly skepticism. He was not a historian anymore. He was a believer. I logged out of the forum, a slow cold smile spreading across my face. I knew exactly what he would do next. He would not share the credit. He would absorb this discovery, make it his own, and use it to reestablish his own fading legacy. He would build his next great work on the foundation of my beautiful, poisoned lie. A month later, the official announcement appeared in the Northwood University Daily Bulletin. The annual Founders Day Symposium was to be held in 2 weeks. It was a major event attended by the entire faculty, major donors, and academic guests from across the country. And the keynote speaker had just been announced, Professor Alistair Finch. The title of his address was Aletheia, How a Lost Manuscript Will Revolutionize Classical History. I looked at the announcement on my screen. The stage was set. The audience was invited. And the star of the show, my arrogant, foolish, and completely doomed professor, was about to deliver the performance of a lifetime, my performance. All I had to do was show up and watch the curtain fall. The day of the Founders Day Symposium was gray and overcast, the Boston sky the color of old pewter. It was a fitting backdrop for an execution. I stood in my small, off-campus apartment, the one I had been forced to rent after my dorm privileges were revoked, and looked at my reflection. I was not a student anymore. I was an outsider, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had violently ejected me. But ghosts, I reminded myself, have their own kind of power. They are invisible, they are patient, and they see everything. I dressed carefully, not as a student, but as a professional. Simple black trousers, a silk blouse, a tailored blazer. I was not here to plead my case. I was here to present my findings. My only piece of jewelry was a small, simple pearl pendant that had belonged to my grandmother. It was a gift she had given me when I first left for Northwood, a small piece of her home in Texas to carry with me into this new, formidable world. I held the pearl between my thumb and forefinger. It was cool and smooth. A small, solid point of calm in the storm to come. Find your own when, Nag, her voice echoed in my memory. Burn brighter. Today, I was going to start a fire dot. My grandfather was waiting for me in his office. He looked older than he had a month ago, the stress of the situation etched in the lines around his eyes. He was not wearing his formal dean's robes, just a simple tweed jacket. He looked like my Lolo again. Lena, he said, his voice heavy. Are you certain about this? There's no turning back after today. I'm certain, I said. I opened my laptop bag and showed him the small, powerful projector adapter I had brought. The trap is set. The bait has been taken. All that's left is to spring it. He looked at my face, searching for any flicker of doubt. He found none. Your Lola, he said, his voice a soft murmur. She was the strongest person I ever knew. She would be so proud of the woman you have become. He took a deep breath. Very well, let us go and see this keynote address. The symposium was held in the university's grandest lecture hall, a soaring cathedral-like space with vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows depicting dead scholars. It was packed. The entire academic hierarchy of Northwood was here, tenured. Professors, ambitious junior faculty, wealthy donors, the provost, and 100 graduate students, all buzzing with intellectual excitement. This was the heart of the world that had cast me out. Walking in beside my grandfather, I felt the ripple of whispers, the sideways glances. I was a scandal. The dean's disgraced granddaughter. It was perfect. They were all watching me, which meant they would all be watching when I made my move. We took our seats, not in the front row reserved for the university's leadership, but in the middle of the auditorium, near an aisle for a quick exit, and more importantly, a few feet from a floor-mounted data port for the projection system. A small, crucial detail I had scouted out the day before. Then he made his entrance. Professor Alistair Finch walked onto the stage to a wave of thunderous applause. He was in his element. He beamed, a benevolent titan of intellect, soaking in the adoration of his peers. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes sweeping across the room, and for a moment they met mine. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible smirk. It was a look of pure, triumphant pity, the look of a victor enjoying the sight of his vanquished foe. He had no idea he was a dead man walking. He began his speech. It was, I had to admit, a brilliant performance. He started with a long, eloquent, and deeply pessimistic assessment of the state of modern historical scholarship we are living. He began, his voice a rich, sonorous baritone that filled the hall, in an age of intellectual crisis. We are drowning in a sea of meaningless data while we starve for a drop of true wisdom. He spoke of the siren song of technology, the temptation to replace the hard, patient work of humanistic inquiry with the empty, soulless calculations of a machine. He never mentioned my name. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. He was taking a victory lap, using the biggest stage of the academic year to publicly dance on the grave of my failed thesis. I sat perfectly. Still, my face a mask of calm neutrality, my heart a cold, steady metronome. Let him climb higher, I thought. The fall will be that much greater. Then he pivoted. But I am not here today to speak of the darkness, he declared, his voice full of a new dramatic fire. I am here to speak of the light. A new brilliant light shed not by a machine, but by the rediscovery of a long-lost human voice. He launched into the story of the Aletheia fragments. He told the story of the reclusive German scholar, Dr. Albrecht Schmidt, and his monumental discovery in a Greek monastery. He praised the old ways of scholarship, the patient, dusty work of archival research that could still, he crowed, yield world-shattering results. He projected images of my fabricated manuscript onto the screen behind him. He read long passages. From it, his voice filled with a scholar's passion. He was performing my words, my beautiful poisoned words, and he was doing it with absolute conviction. For decades, he thundered, I have argued that Plato's work was not a philosophical Big Bang, but the culmination of a long and largely lost tradition of thought. I was a lone voice in the wilderness. I was dismissed. He paused, letting the drama build. But these fragments, the words of the brilliant, forgotten philosopher Zenids of Miletus, they prove what I have always known to be true. My fingers were resting on my laptop. Inside my bag, the Project Delphi program was open and waiting. I was a silent observer, a cold, clinical fact-checker for his grand performance of lies. He began to lay out the proof. He presented the fabricated correspondence with its subtle, fatal anachronism as a revolutionary discovery. Poison pill number 1, swallowed. He quoted the altered passage from a known text, presenting its new, false meaning as a stunning reinterpretation. Poison pill number 2, swallowed. And then he came to my favorite part. The poem, and here, he said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, is the most beautiful, most heartbreaking piece of it all. A fragmented poem by Zenids, a lament for a dying tradition. He projected my own words, the ones I had written in my dorm room, onto the giant screen. He read it, first in the original Greek, and then in his own soaring English translation. He spoke of its haunting, irregular meter, a sign of its raw, untutored genius. Irregular is one word for it, I thought, a grim smile touching my lips. Statistically improbable is another. Poison pill number 3, swallowed whole. He was not just presenting the work, he was claiming it. He was weaving it into the fabric of his own legacy. He was using my forgery to cement his place in the pantheon of great historians. I looked at my grandfather. He was watching Finch, his face unreadable, but I saw his hand, resting on his knee, clench into a fist. He knew just as I did that this was no longer a matter of academic disagreement. This was a lie. A grand, public, and profoundly arrogant lie. And it was being told on his stage that Professor Finch reached the crescendo of his speech. "So what does this teach us?" he asked the captivated audience. "It teaches us that truth is not found in an algorithm. It is not revealed in a spreadsheet. It is found here," he said, tapping his chest, "in the human heart, in the patient, dedicated human mind." He looked out at the crowd, his eyes shining with the light of his own perceived brilliance. "Let us not be seduced by the easy answers of machines. Let us, instead, have the courage to do the hard work of being human." He finished. The hall was silent for a beat, and then it erupted into a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. The faculty, the students, the donors, they were all on their feet, applauding the great man. He stood bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight, his arms slightly outstretched, accepting their worship. He was at the absolute apex of his career, a titan vindicated, a prophet honored. The smug, pitying smirk he shot in my direction was no longer subtle. It was a victory salute. The applause finally died down. The symposium moderator stepped up to the podium. "Thank you, Professor Finch, for that absolutely masterful address. The professor has graciously agreed to take a few questions from the audience." This was it, my moment. My grandfather looked at me, his expression a single unspoken question. "Are you ready?" I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. My hand reached into my bag and closed around the cool, smooth surface of my laptop. The hunt was over. The trap was sprung. All that was left to do was show the world the monster I had caught. The standing ovation for Professor Finch was a physical force, a wave of sound and adoration that washed over the stage. He stood in the spotlight, a benevolent king accepting the worship of his court. The moderator, a fawning professor from the English department, finally stepped up to the podium, wiping a tear from his eye. "Thank you, Professor Finch, for that absolutely masterful address," he gushed. "The professor has graciously agreed to take a few questions from the audience." This was the moment. My heart was a cold, steady drum. My grandfather beside me gave my hand a slight squeeze. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of reinforcement. "Steel yourself." I stood up. A microphone was brought to me in the aisle. As I took it, a new wave of whispers rippled through the auditorium. "It's the dean's granddaughter. What is she doing?" This is going to be awkward. Awkward, I thought, was a spectacular understatement. I waited for the whispers to die down. I looked up at the stage, at the man who had destroyed my future. He was looking at me with an expression of bored, weary condescension. The look a king gives a peasant who has dared to speak out of turn. Double quotes. "Yes, Miss Reyes?" he said, his voice dripping with false patience. "Do you have a question?" "I do, Professor," I said, my voice clear and calm, ringing through the silent hall. "I was fascinated by your analysis of the new manuscript, particularly the correspondence you cited between Xenix and his contemporary, Philetus. One letter, Xenix uses the phrase psyches anemos, which you translated as soul's wind. A beautiful, poetic turn of phrase, is it not?" he said with a smug smile. "It is," I agreed. "It's also an anachronism. According to the Leiden corpus of classical linguistics, that specific idiomatic phrase doesn't appear in any known Greek text until the 2nd century AD, nearly 500 years after your Xenix was supposedly writing. I was wondering how you account for that discrepancy." The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into a silent pool. The silence was no longer reverent, it was tense. A few of the linguists in the front row began to murmur to each other. Finch's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A fascinating observation. Miss Reyes, he said, recovering quickly, and one that a student, relying on the blunt instrument of a database search, might easily make. But true scholarship understands that language is fluid. This is clearly a rare early usage, an outlier, a testament to the author's genius. He thought he had dismissed me. He was wrong. An interesting theory, Professor, I continued, my voice still perfectly level. Let's move to the poem you cited. You praised its haunting, irregular meter. My own analysis, however, shows that the meter is not just irregular. It is statistically unique. It contains a dactylic to spondaic ratio that has a 0.01% chance of appearing in any authentic work from that period. It is, in a literary sense, a statistical impossibility. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. Finch's face was beginning to flush a dangerous shade of red. Your analysis? He sneered. Are you referring to the same black box algorithm that you tried to pass off as a thesis? I believe this panel has already established the unreliability of your methods. Perhaps, I said. But let me ask one final question. It is about the author of the Aletheia fragments himself, the reclusive Dr. Albrecht Schmidt. I have searched every academic and monastic database I can find. He seems to have no prior publications, no academic history, no digital footprint whatsoever. For a man who has made the most revolutionary discovery of the century, he is remarkably non-existent. I paused, letting my words hang in the air. Professor Finch, you are a world-renowned expert. You must have vetted your source. Can you please tell this audience who exactly is Dr. Albrecht Schmidt? I had him. His face was a mask of pure, cornered fury. He knew the source was a ghost. He had been so blinded by his own confirmation bias that he had never bothered to do the most basic scholarly due diligence. I am not here to be cross-examined by a failed student. He boomed, his voice full of bluster. This is a Q&A, not an inquisition. You're out of your depth, Miss Reyes. You are right, Professor, I said, my voice suddenly resonating with a new, hard-won power. I am out of my depth because I am not a classicist. I am a computer scientist. I looked out at the sea of confused, captivated faces, and I am also a writer. As the sole author of the manuscript you have based your entire address on, the Aletheia fragments, written under the pseudonym of the fictional Dr. Albrecht Schmidt, I can assure you that your confusion over the anachronisms is entirely justified, because I wrote them that way. The explosion in the room was not a sound. It was a sudden, sharp intake of 1,000 breaths at once. It was a shockwave of pure, unadulterated disbelief. Finch stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning. I set the microphone down and calmly walked from the aisle to the stage, my laptop in my hand. No one stopped me. The moderator was frozen, his face a comical mask of horror. I walked to the podium, unplugged Finch's laptop, and plugged in my own. The screen behind the stage, which had moments before been displaying my fabricated Greek poem, now showed the elegant, complex interface of Project Delphi. My beautiful, malign machine, Professor. Finch was right about one thing, I said, my voice now amplified by the podium microphone, calm and clear and cutting. He said my thesis was a black box. So I thought, in the interest of academic transparency, I would show you all how it works. My hands flew across the keyboard. I opened a new file and uploaded the full text of the keynote address Professor Finch had just delivered. My program, Project Delphi, was designed to do one thing, I explained, my voice echoing in the stunned silence. It was designed to find the truth by identifying statistical and historical impossibilities. I will now run an analysis of the professor's speech. I hit the enter key. The program came to life. On the giant screen, the text of Finch's speech appeared. The AI began to parse it, lines of code scrolling too fast for the human eye to read. And then it began to find the poison pills I had planted. A section of the text flashed bright red. A pop-up window appeared beside it. Linguistic anomaly detected. The phrase, psyches anemos, is statistically inconsistent with the stated time period. Probability of authentic usage, 0.02%. Another section flashed red. Source text mismatch. The quoted passage does not match the authenticated primary source text. Alteration probability, 99.8% dot, and then the poem. The entire stanza flashed a deep, bloody crimson. Metrical analysis failed. The dactylic spondaic ratio is a 7 sigma statistical outlier inconsistent with all known works of the period. Probability. A forgery, 100%. One by one, my program, my failed thesis, was dismantling his entire speech. It was a live, public, and utterly devastating intellectual vivisection. I was using my creation to show the entire academic world that their great, respected titan was not just a plagiarist who had stolen the work of a non-existent scholar. He was a fool who had been duped by a student he had tried to destroy. When the analysis was complete, the screen was a sea of red flags. A summary window popped up. Conclusion: the core historical claims of this address are based on a fabricated source. Document and are verifiably false. I turned from the screen to face the audience. Then I looked at Professor Finch. He had collapsed into a chair behind the podium, his face the color of ash. He was a ruined man. His life's work, his reputation, all of it, incinerated in a 5-minute public demonstration. My thesis was never about replacing the historian. I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent, horrified room. It was about creating a tool to help us see the truth more clearly. I gestured to the screen, to the beautiful, brutal evidence of his fraud. As you can see, it works. I disconnected my laptop, packed it in my bag, and walked off the stage. I didn't look back. My grandfather was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps. The crowd parted for us as we walked up the aisle. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand on my shoulder. It was the proudest, heaviest weight I had ever felt. We walked out of the auditorium together, leaving the wreckage of Professor Finch's career and an entire school of thought behind us. 1 year later, to the day. August 3rd, 2026. I am in my new office at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I am not a student here. I am a fellow, the youngest in the university's history. My thesis was not just passed. It was published, and it started a fire in the world of humanities that is still burning brightly. Project Delphi is now being used by scholars all over the world. My grandfather appears on my screen for our weekly video call. He is beaming. I just came from a board meeting, Lena, he says. A major tech philanthropist has given the university a $20 million grant to create a new, permanent center for the university. That's wonderful, Lolo, I say, my heart swelling with pride for him. It is, he says. They are going to study the intersection of technology and the humanities. They are going to build on the work that you started. He pauses, and I see tears in his eyes. They have just voted on the name. It will be called the Elena Reyes Center for Digital Humanities. He named it after her. After my Lola, after the woman from Texas who taught me how to be strong. I look at my grandfather, my brilliant, loving Lolo, and I finally understand. The revenge was never the point. The victory wasn't in seeing Finch fall. The true victory was in building something new from the ashes. He had tried to blow out my candle, and my grandfather, my Lolo, my wise and wonderful dean, had just helped me turn it into a lighthouse. And it would burn brighter and longer than I could have ever imagined. Of course. My name is Maria, and my story begins where Elena Reyes's ended, with a ghost, the ghost of my own future. I grew up in a small house in Texas, a place where the mountains are a deep, permanent green and the sea is a constant humming presence. My world was small, beautiful, and profoundly limited. My parents were rice farmers. Their hands were calloused, their faces lined by the sun, and their greatest dream was that my future would be bigger than the plot of land. They tended thought my gift was not for the land, but for stories, for history. I devoured every book in our small town library. I wrote papers on the local history of the Visayan resistance during the war, on the trade routes that had once made our small port a bustling hub. I was a scholar with no university, a historian with no library. My dream of attending a real university, a place like Northwood in America, was a fantasy as distant and unattainable as the moon. My future, I knew, was to stay here, to find a simple job, to let my mind, my real gift, slowly wither like a plant starved of light. The email arrived on a hot, humid evening. It was from an address I didn't recognize, Elena Reyes Center at northwood.edu. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but something made me open it. The subject line was, the Elena Reyes Texas Scholarship. My heart began to pound. I read the first line, Dear Maria Santos, on behalf of the selection committee for the Elena Reyes Center for Digital Humanities at Northwood University, it is my profound honor to offer you a full 4-year scholarship to study at Northwood, with all tuition, accommodation, and travel expenses covered. I read the line 3 times. It didn't make sense. It was like a letter from another dimension. I scrolled down, my hands trembling, and I learned the story. The scholarship was a new, permanent endowment, created specifically for one promising student of history from the town of Texas Antique each year. It was funded in perpetuity by the center's founder, a legendary professor in the field of digital humanities. A woman named Dr. Lena Reyes, a woman whose own grandmother had been born in this very town. I ran out of our small house, the screen of my phone clutched in my hand, and found my parents coming in from the fields. I couldn't speak. I just showed them the email. I watched my father's tired face crumble as he read the words, the tears silently tracing paths through the dust on his cheeks. I watched my mother let out a small, joyous cry and wrap her arms around me. In that moment, the ghost of my future, the one I had already made my peace with, vanished. And a new one, a brilliant, terrifying, and impossibly bright one, took its place. 10 years after Professor Finch's career had ended in a blaze of public humiliation, the Elena Reyes Center for Digital Humanities was the most prestigious and innovative institution of its kind in the world. The night Maria Santos, the farmer's daughter from Texas, was walking through its glass doors, it was not the cold, intimidating stone hall I had imagined. The center was a beautiful modern building of glass and light wood, but it was filled with warmth. The walls were decorated not with portraits of dead white men, but with vibrant, beautiful art from the Philippines. I saw a brilliant, abstract painting that I recognized as a Zobel. I saw hand-woven tappy textiles displayed like tapestries. And on the main wall of the sunlit atrium, there was a massive, stunning photograph of the beach at sunset in my own hometown, Texas. I felt a lump form in my throat. I was half a world away, but I had never felt so close to home. A woman with kind, intelligent eyes and a familiar, quiet strength approached me. You must be Maria, she said, her smile warm. I'm Lena. Welcome to the center. Dr. Lena Reyes. She was a legend, a name I had read in a dozen academic journals, but in person she was just calm. She gave me a tour of the facility herself. She showed me the massive servers that powered the updated Project Delphi, which was now used by universities around the world. She showed me the labs, the libraries, and then she took me to her office dot. It was a beautiful, light-filled room. And on her wall, next to her own diplomas, was a simple framed photograph of an older American woman with a defiant, joyful smile, standing on a beach I recognized. "That's my Lola," Lena said, seeing me look at it. "Elena, the woman this place is named for, she was from your hometown." "I know," I said softly. "Everyone in Texas knows the story of Elena Reyes." "Do they?" she asked, a small, sad smile on her face. "I'm not sure they know the whole story." She told me to sit, and for the next hour, she told me everything. She told me about her thesis, about a bitter old professor named Finch. She told me about the public humiliation, about the betrayal. And she told me about her grandfather, the dean, who had refused to save her and had instead challenged her to save herself. "This center," she said, gesturing to the building around us, "was not born from a victory. It was born from a failure. It was born from a moment of profound humiliation. My revenge against Professor Finch, it felt good for a day, maybe a week, but the satisfaction faded. It was the act of building this place, of creating a legacy for my grandmother that would give people like you a chance she never had. That's the victory that lasts." She walked over to a terminal and logged in. The elegant interface of Project Delphi appeared on the screen. "My work was once called a magic trick," she said. "A black box, but it's not magic, it's a tool. A tool that helps us listen to the ghosts of the past, to hear the stories that have been silenced." She looked at me, her eyes full of a fierce, encouraging light. "This scholarship, this center, it's all just a tool. Now it's your turn. What stories are you going to listen to? What ghosts are you going to give a voice to?" I spent the rest of that day in the center's main library. I sat at a terminal, the full, awesome power of Project Delphi at my fingertips. I was a fisherman's great-granddaughter, given a ship that could sail the entire ocean of history. Wait. That afternoon, I typed my first query into the search bar. I was looking for records, for mentions, for the forgotten history of the Visayan guerrilla fighters in the mountains of Panay during the Second World War. I was looking for the story my own great-grandfather had been a part of. The story that had helped inspire Lena Reyes to fight her own war dot as the AI began its work. Its beautiful, complex web of connections spreading across my screen, I looked up at the plaque on the wall. The Elena Reyes Center for Digital Humanities. I thought of the two women, Elena and Lena, the grandmother from Texas and the granddaughter from Boston. Two halves of one story of resilience. I thought of the invisible line that stretched from their stone farmhouse in Provence to this glass-walled building in Boston and all the way back to my own small, humble home in the Philippines. A woman from Texas had, in her quiet way, helped to save the world. Her granddaughter had saved her story, and now it was my turn. I had been given a gift, a legacy of strength passed down through the hands of defiant women. I was a scholar from Texas, and I had work to do.